decided that coming back isn't his thing. But I did reach out to him this past week and just to make sure he wanted me to teach class, and he said yes. So I thought he was coming back like late last night, but maybe I was mistaken. My memory is terrible. But at any rate, that gives us a chance to tie everything together. We were talking about the shift in culture, the phrase that, thanks to Charles, that's now stuck in my brain, that the church as we know it is done. I like that phrase, actually. And there's this big question mark, like what's next? And it's not just us. It's this is literally replicated everywhere. I was on the phone with a preacher friend of mine here in Pennsylvania, out from Eastern Pennsylvania, who called me that was Friday, and we were just talking life and different things, and I had no idea where they were at. I knew when he moved back to Pennsylvania, probably 6-7 years ago. Their congregation was what I would consider pretty healthy, strong. I think they were somewhere around 200 in weekly attendance. They were really active out in the community. Outreach was, that was kind of their thing. And, they were really, he was really missionally focused on evangelism, getting out into the community, bringing people in who are unchurched. And, as I was talking to him, he said, we're kind of grappling with this post-COVID church. And he said, our weekly attendance is about 30. And he said, we're down to 40 solid members as far as membership. And he said, but weekly attendance, he said, we're right about 30. And that's our new normal. He took a full-time job. And so he's still preaching, and he said, I'm going to continue preaching, but he said the church is at a point where very quickly they went from, being able to support me and my family well to that just got wiped out like almost instantly. And so that was interesting talking to him and seeing how quick that shift happened. As I mentioned, I was at Camp Manatani this past weekend, speaking at a men's retreat. And so there were people from congregations all over New Jersey. I think it was mostly New Jersey and Pennsylvania. But, I'd say probably at least a dozen different churches were represented there. And there was quickly a theme that emerged, and this isn't what I was talking about. I wasn't talking about the culture of the church or the shift in church. My theme was rest. And just the need for that spiritual rest, that God designed us to rest. And one of the guys showed up the first night. He was wearing pajamas. He had a pillow, he had a teddy bear, and he had a children's book called Bedtime Stories. and he said, well, I heard you were talking about rest. So he's like, I wanted to show up prepared. So I appreciated that. That was good to come prepared. But this theme started to emerge pretty quickly of I saw, witnessed, heard a group of men who are just so worn out and tired. And they said, all of their churches, there was one guy there who quipped that he was a mega church minister. And he said, I actually preach at a mega church in our area, and he said, we have like pretty steady 80 as our weekly attendance. And that was, by far the largest church that was represented there. A lot of us have connections to King of Prussia, and at one time King of Prussia was a pretty good size congregation. Their weekly attendance is about 40. And so it was kind of interesting. Hi, Brent, we already talked about you. Now we can't anymore. Welcome back. Yeah. So I was just mentioning I was away at Camp Manatani, and there was a theme this past weekend that emerged where people were talking about these dwindling churches, and all of these congregations at one point were pretty healthy, fairly large, fairly outgoing churches. And so for me, it kind of reiterated that idea that it's not an imagined issue that's happening with our churches. It's happening. Literally every single congregation that was represented this past weekend is experiencing the same exact thing. And so there's this big question, where is the church heading? And there were different ideas and different opinions, and there were some people who were really discouraged by it, and some people were saying, well, the church is kind of doomed, and we know we're going to be closing our doors, and so there was kind of a wide spectrum of opinions about where they were. But I take a different view, and you guys know from the last few weeks, my view is that there's an emerging trend of lay people who are untrained ministers going into ministry, not only voluntarily, but willfully and with full-on commitment. There are house churches that are emerging at a pretty steady pace. We mentioned Christianity in other countries. In Iran, it's the fastest growing. Christianity is the fastest growing in Iran out of any country in the world. Iran. The gospel in China is exploding. Christianity is exploding. The average house church in Iran, 100% of the churches are house churches. 100% of them. The average largest congregation in Iran is 15 people. And there's I think they estimate like 1.3 million Christians in Iran right now. And these are like, the vast majority are like non-denominational, like back to Bible basics, kind of like the Restoration Plea, which is kind of interesting to me. They don't want to hear doctrine. They don't want to hear about what this denomination is doing or what this denomination teaches. They want the Bible. And I'm extremely encouraged by that. And so I think what we need to do is we need to harness that. And we have, right now we have boatloads, literally boatloads of migrants, illegal migrants coming to our country. Now, we can complain all day long, and we should. This is even happening. It's horrific. It's inhumane. It's awful. There's nothing compassionate about just having open borders and people having to fend for themselves. It's not right. But we can bemoan that all day long, or we can say they're here and they're coming. There are people coming to Somerset. Right in our own community. This is all over the country. These migrants they're here. And so what do we do as Bible-believing Christians with people who are here looking for a better life? How do we treat them? How do we teach them? How do we minister to them? And so, the harvest is so plentiful, and that was also a theme that we picked up on this weekend. Everybody there recognized the harvest is absolutely ripened for the picking. There is no lack of people who are hungry for the good news of Jesus. There's no shortage. From the smallest town to the biggest cities, there's no shortage of people desperate for the good news. So I want to look at some scriptures, because it's kind of that practical question, and I'm a practical thinking person. where I don't like to just study about this stuff. I like to say, well, what do we do about it? Right? What's our place in this community and beyond? So Acts chapter 15, or 16 rather, starting in verse 1. I'm going to read 1 through 5 and then kind of skip ahead. This is the second missionary journey. If you remember the first one, Paul goes to Lystra and Derbe. He's stoned, left for dead. And then he kind of dusts himself off. And he starts hitting the campaign trail, finishes up that first missionary journey. And then on the second journey, Paul and Barnabas have this radical disagreement. They part ways. They can't agree because Barnabas wants to bring John Mark. Paul says absolutely not. He abandoned us on the first missionary journey, so why should he come? They couldn't agree on that, and so they parted ways. And so Paul is out on the second missionary journey with Silas, and this is what Luke records. Paul came also to Derbe and to Lystra. A disciple there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the brothers at Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. As they went on their way through the cities, they delivered to them for observance the decisions that had been reached by the apostles and elders who were in Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened in the faith, and they increased in numbers daily. All right, a couple things that I want to point out. One is that I've mentioned this so many times here before, but how old roughly was Timothy? Ballpark. We don't really know for sure, but ballpark. What's that? Yeah. What'd you say?
Young teen.
Yeah, probably young teen, probably 13, 14 years old. Ouch. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that wouldn't have felt too good. The things you do to preach, huh? So I find that interesting because you guys know this is a soapbox of mine, but we culturally, not we as congregationally, but we culturally hold kids back and produce a level of immaturity, both spiritual and otherwise. We produce a level of immaturity in children that we basically are teaching them that they should take a box of crayons, go sit in a corner and, bang their crayons together till they figure out how to actually use them and wipe the drool from their mouth kind of thing. And I'm like, Paul grabbed Timothy and discipled him. Now, do you think Timothy hit this trail with Paul right out of the gate and just was making the most wise decisions and was just this brilliant 13, 14-year-old kid who's going out there and is telling people how to get their, telling 40 and 50-year-olds how to get their life right with Christ? Do you think that was the case?
I want to throw, the little...
The Charles wrench? Uh-huh.
Your first statement there regarding the 40 and 50-year-olds, that's a rare thing.
Yeah. Life expectancy, was pretty low.
36 years old, you're an old man.
Mm-hmm.
Which also indicates if you're at 16, you're halfway through life.
Midlife crisis.
Literally.
Yeah.
By the time you're 9 or 10, you're already involved heavily in family businesses. And this is to what you said earlier, that today we're training people down.
Yes.
Literally. We're talking 20-year-olds now who can't leave home because they don't have any experience.
Yeah.
In those days, you're 9 or 10, you should be functioning on your own for the family business or enterprise.
Mm-hmm.
It was a question of how they taught and the urgency of that teaching. They didn't have the luxury of taking, you for the first 5 or 6 years waiting to send you to school. You had to be up and running as soon as you could be up and running and being productive, or the family died.
Sure.
So, world of difference in the culture, and people tend to rise to the lowest level of expectation.
Wow.
Regardless of
Yeah.
age.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, if you didn't hear that online, he said people tend to rise to the lowest level of expectation. And that's a very true statement. So if we set the bar low, and culturally, I mean, yeah, people now on average are getting married, if they get married at all, in their, like 25, 26 is now the average for people to get married. We've really slowed down this sense of urgency, and the life expectancy keeps extending. And so there's not this sense of urgency that we've got to do something right now. And so that's permeated our church culture, over the years, where even when, I love church history, and I've read so many books. If you look in my office, there's just like bookshelves full of restoration history books. And back then too, tuberculosis consumption was a major killer. And so there was always this sense of urgency that at any time, any one of our family members could get sick with consumption and die. And it was a gross, painful, awful death. It was a bad way to die. And so kids were witnessing this. Families typically, you had multi-generations living in the same home. Alexander Campbell himself, when he was out on the trail preaching, he would leave his young sons would have to take care of ailing siblings, or grandpa when Thomas Campbell got sick. Actually, when you visit the Campbell mansion, you see the beds right beside each other. And one of them, I forget which one of his sons, but one of his sons was there when Thomas Campbell, the elder Campbell, was dying. They moved this young boy into the room to care for his grandfather. I mean, that was normal procedure. And so there was this sense of urgency that we've got to share the gospel with people because they might not live another day. And we might not live another day. That sense of urgency is gone. And so now we've moved from a sense of urgency to an overwhelming sense of apathy. We see it in the job force. Right? We mentioned this before. Like your job, every one of us, pick a job, and they're just starved for employees. They can't find them. Apathy has taken over. Yeah, DP's shaking his head. You guys well staffed? No. Nowhere is. Look at our medical field, at how starved they are for employees, for nurses, doctors, even office staff. They can't find anybody. There's this overwhelming sense of apathy, and yet life goes on, and people are still, even though life expectancy is longer here in the United States, life is still kicking people in the rear end, and it's just beating them up. So, I think even though culturally we're in a different place, we've got to get back to discipleship and urgent discipleship.
I got a question for you.
Yeah.
When Timothy went with Paul,
How long did Timothy stay with Paul before Timothy went out on his own? Did he?
Yeah, it was several years. Yeah.
So he was taught by Paul as they went along, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he's with them through the second and third missionary journeys.
He was ready to do it, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and this wasn't like,
It didn't happen.
it's kind of an interesting thing, and I think about, I've mentioned this before, but I think about my training when I started driving truck, and we just drove past the Schneider facility in Carlisle yesterday, and I pointed out to Cameron, and I was like, there's where I learned, I was trained how to drive. And, it was like classrooms for 6 hours a day, and then the rest of the day for another like 4 hours or so, we were out in the parking lot, touching trucks and, learning how to pre-trip them, and then taking them out on the road. And I was like, in 3 weeks, I got my first truck assignment. I was on my own. And there was no, like, holding my hand and, like, we're here for you. And if you have any problems or, somebody will be with you all along the way. No, it was like, here are the keys to your truck. Figure it out. My first trip was, I picked my truck up in Connecticut and drove to Dallas, Texas. The day I pulled into Dallas, Texas was on 9/11/2001, and all these airplanes are hitting the, like, unprecedented world event, and the entire trucking industry shut down, like came to a grinding halt. I had to figure that out. Like, there was no calling somebody up and being like, all right, where's the manual for how to handle this, right? Figure it out. Figure it out. You're a grown-up now. You're a big boy. Figure it out. And we don't do that to people.
How old were you?
Just barely 21. I had just turned 21. Which is the age you have to be able to cross state lines with the CDL. You can get your CDL at 18, but you have to be 21 to cross state lines. And so we don't do that to people. We don't disciple our kids and put them in uncomfortable positions and tell them figure it out. Like we'll mentor you, we'll train you, but go. We don't do that anymore. And so discipleship, I think, is really missing. And I think when we get it back, we'll stop focusing on the structure of the church. And we mentioned it last week, that's the God that we're holding on to, that we're like, we can't stop meeting behind these four walls. And so we're going to do everything we can to program the church to stay into existence for as long as possible. That's not how the church functioned at all. The church functioned in these small groups. And just like the next little verse, we're not going to read it, but verses 11 through 15, this is Lydia in this tiny little place outside of Philippi. He converts Lydia, and they have maybe 5 people, maybe. And that's the birth of the church in Philippi, which became a very significant church. We have a letter to the church at Philippi, Philippians. This was not a big, powerful group of people. Paul didn't stay in Philippi for, he wasn't a located preacher for 15, 20 years. Paul was in and out of Philippi in a matter of days. In fact, he's arrested. We'll pick up there. You guys are familiar with this, but starting in verse 16 of chapter 16. As we were going to the place of prayer, we were met by a slave girl who had a spirit of divination and brought her owners much gain by fortune-telling. She followed Paul and us, crying out, "These men are servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to you the way of salvation." And this she kept doing for many days. Paul, having become greatly annoyed, turned and said to the spirit, "I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her." And it came out that very hour. By the way, young Timothy is with Paul when this happens. But when her owners saw that their hope of gain was gone, they seized Paul and Silas, dragged them into the marketplace before the rulers, and when they had brought them to the magistrates, they said, "These men are Jews, and they're disturbing our city. They advocate customs that are not lawful for us as Romans to accept or practice." The crowd joined in attacking them, and the magistrates tore the garments off them and gave orders to beat them with rods. And when they had inflicted many blows upon them, they threw them into prison, ordering the jailer to keep them safely. Having received this order, he put them into the inner prison and fastened their feet in the stocks. All right, and then you all know the rest of the story. I'm going to have to, for time's sake, skip through a little bit. But the doors were opened in the middle of the night. Paul and Silas are singing, which, by the way, I never really thought about this. I don't know why. I didn't think about this until now, but where's Timothy? Timothy, right, had just joined them on this missionary journey. And now Paul and Silas, who are the campaign leaders, so to speak, they're the mentors. Both of them are beaten. They're stripped away. And I don't know if it was because of Timothy's age that Timothy wasn't beaten and put in prison, or if Timothy maybe was off somewhere in a distance and they captured, because this happened pretty quickly, right? Yeah, it's true, Luke, yeah. So Luke is with them. So it kind of begs the question, where are they?
Well, they're Greek, as opposed to Jews.
Yeah,
If you're a Greek, Greek meaning only a Gentile, what's the chance they're perceived as Roman rather than Jewish?
that's true. Yeah, yep, that's a good possibility. And it's Philippi. It's named after Philip. Very Roman city. That's a good possibility, that because they were Greek, Luke and Timothy, they just didn't get arrested.
And besides, you always go after the head of the snake.
That's right. So, the jail opens up. The guard is about to kill himself because, well, he's going to be killed. So he's about to take his own life. Paul tells him not to. Verse 28, Paul cried with a loud voice, "Do not harm yourself, for we are all here." And the jailer called for lights and rushed in, and trembling with fear, he fell down before Paul and Silas. Then he brought them out and said, "Sirs," this is such a fascinating question, "what must I do to be saved?" We strip away the power of God so often in that conversion process, and we make it about us and our knowledge of the Bible, and we're going to teach people and we're going to instruct them. And the sermon today is about don't be right, be faithful. Winning arguments is not why we're here. Having all the right theology and mastering that and getting that all right is not our lot in life. Our lot in life is to be faithful. We're going to make mistakes. But the question is, are we in a corner reading our Bibles and exegeting passages, or are we living our faith, discipling people, and leading people to the cross? And I love this passage because the jailer, he ends up being baptized, he and his household, and then Paul and Silas disappear. And Timothy and Luke, they're gone. And so there's this brand new church who had to figure it out. It wasn't huge, that they didn't have all these resources, they didn't have a located minister, they didn't have elders, they didn't have deacons. That this was a small group of people who still had water dripping off of them. They were just baptized, immersed into Christ. And that's the church in Philippi.
They were told to go, right?
Absolutely.
Magistrate said,
Yeah.
Let them go, tell them to go.
Yeah.
And they left.
Yeah. And that's when Paul kind of dug his heels in. No, they did this to us. They can lead us out. We're not leaving quietly, which I love. But I'll wrap it up by saying this. I think we're going to see more of this happening. Do you think the church in Philippi got everything right? Do you think this was like the most well-oiled machine and they were like just had this banging worship service on Sunday, and, had this preacher that had spent 4 years in college and 4 years in seminary, and, came in and just was such a good orator and had everything together. I don't think at all. I think this church was so tiny. If I picture the singing of a group this small, you ever sung with a very small group of people? It doesn't sound the greatest usually, unless they're practiced musicians. I don't think they had the best singing in the world. I think this was a small group of Christians who was faithful to God. They made a lot of mistakes. They got a lot of things wrong, and they had to figure it out. And God blessed that church in Philippi. This was one of the most important churches in the first century, hands down, period. And it was a small group of people. They didn't even have a building. This is a small group of women meeting outside of Philippi. Lydia wasn't even from Philippi. You have this tiny group of people meeting by a river, and that's the church. And it's beautiful, and God blessed it. So I think this is probably more out of necessity where the church and our country is headed. I think we're going to start losing resources. Church buildings are at a breakneck speed are closing doors, hanging up for sale signs on the buildings. Funds are dried up. Resources are dried up. Out of necessity, this kind of thing is going to happen, and I think it's going to be a beautiful, magnificent thing. All right, we're going to end there. We're out of time. Thank you, guys, and I hope you're encouraged by that. We'll see you in a little bit.